Welcome back to Quick Country Histories. Today, we're diving into Belarus, a country whose story is just, well, it's fascinating. It's been forged right at the crossroads of Europe, and for centuries, its identity has been this constant tug of war, a fierce spirit of independence versus the massive influence of these giant empires next door. So here's how we're going to break it down. We'll start with its early Slavic foundations, move into the Grand Duchy and the Commonwealth, then see what happens under the Russian Empire. After that, we'll tackle the incredibly chaotic 20th century, and finally, look at its path to independence. All right, let's jump in. We're starting way back, between the 6th and 8th centuries. This is when East Slavic tribes first started to settle the land we now call Belarus. They're making their homes in these dense forests, by these winding rivers, and they're really laying the foundation for what would become the region's first major power. So you had these three key tribes, the Krivians, Drahovians, and Radzimians, who really formed the core of the population. And out of this mix, the Principality of Polotsk emerges. And listen, it wasn't just some minor player. It became a real powerhouse within the larger Kiev Rus world. They weren't just a vassal state, no way. Polotsk was constantly flexing its muscles, asserting its independence, and even rivaling huge centers like Kiev and Novgorod. I mean, building their own Cathedral of the Holy Wisdom, that was a massive statement. It was like saying, hey, we're here and we matter. And it's really important to get this. Polotsk wasn't just about politics and power. It was this vibrant cultural hub. You have these incredible figures driving a kind of golden age. People like Euphrosyne of Polotsk, a nun who was a huge champion for literacy and the arts. And then there's Bishop Kirill of Turov. This guy's writings were so influential they were read all across the East Slavic world. But then, things change dramatically. In the 13th century, a huge upheaval just turns everything on its head. I'm talking about the Mongol invasions from the east. They come crashing in and just completely shatter the unity of Kiev and Rus. This creates a massive power vacuum, and it's going to totally reshape the destiny of this whole region. So with Kiev, the traditional center of power, sacked and weakened, what happens? Well, the principalities in what's now Belarus get absorbed into the expanding Grand Duchy of Lithuania. And what's interesting is this wasn't always some violent conquest. A lot of these smaller principalities actually joined up willingly. They were looking for protection, for some stability in a really chaotic time. Now, this is a really crucial point. The rulers of the Grand Duchy, they were Lithuanian. But the vast majority of the people living there, they were East Slavic. And you can see this perfectly in the status of the Ruthenian language, which is basically an early form of Belarusian. It actually became the official language of the government, of the courts. That just goes to show you how culturally dominant the Belarusian lands were inside this big, multi-ethnic state. Okay, so that setup doesn't last forever. In 1569, things shift in a big way with something called the Union of Lublin. This creates a new superstate, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And this new entity, it was totally dominated by Poland. So what happens to the Belarusian nobility? Well, to keep their status and their power, they start to assimilate. They adopt the Polish language, they convert to Roman Catholicism. It's a huge cultural change. And this process, this Polonization, had some really profound effects. First, Polish officially kicks out Ruthenian as the language of government. Then you have the Union of Brest, which creates a whole new church, the Greek Catholic Church. They basically followed Orthodox traditions but were loyal to the Pope in Rome. As you can imagine, this created deep, deep religious divides. You now had this Polonized Catholic nobility on one side and the mostly Orthodox common people on the other. So all these internal divisions, plus constant wars, start to weaken the Commonwealth a lot. Eventually, it gets to a breaking point. And that brings us to our next chapter, where the Belarusian lands are about to fall under the control of a new and very powerful empire to the east. Yep, by the end of the 18th century, the Commonwealth is basically carved up like a pie by its neighbors, Russia, Prussia, and Austria. This whole process is called the Partitions of Poland, and by the time it's done in 1795, all of what we now call Belarus is absorbed into the Russian Empire, and it's going to stay that way for more than 100 years. The Russian czars waste no time. They have a very clear strategy for these new territories. It's basically a two-step plan. Step 1. Depolonization. Erase all that Polish cultural influence. Step 2. Russification. Fully integrate the people into the empire. And how do they do that? By imposing the Russian language, Russian laws, and really aggressively suppressing that Greek Catholic Church to push everyone back towards Russian Orthodoxy. But here's where it gets really interesting, kind of paradoxical. These super repressive policies, they accidentally spark the birth of modern Belarusian nationalism. You see, that old Ruthenian culture from the Grand Duchy days, it had been pushed down, but it never completely disappeared. So now, squeezed between both Polish and Russian pressure, a handful of intellectuals start to dig into their own local folklore. They start to formally write down the rules of the Belarusian language, and they start publishing in it. Guys like Konstantin Kalinovsky become the first real champions of a separate, distinct Belarusian identity. So this new national feeling is just starting to bubble up, and it's about to be tested in the most extreme way possible. The turn of the 20th century unleashes an absolute storm of chaos across Eastern Europe. You've got World War I, the Russian Revolution, Civil War, and the lands of Belarus are right in the middle of it all, turned into a massive battlefield. And in this power vacuum, you see these brief, almost frantic attempts to create a country. In 1918, while it's under German occupation, they declare the Belarusian People's Republic, but that doesn't last. The moment the Germans leave, the Red Army marches in and sets up a Soviet republic instead. The whole messy conflict ends with the Treaty of Riga in 1921, which is just a tragedy for Belarus. It literally splits the country in two. The western part goes to Poland, and the eastern part becomes part of the Soviet Union. And life on either side of that new border was just awful. In the West, under Polish control, Belarusians faced another round of Polonization. Their language, their schools, all suppressed. But in the Soviet East, it was even worse. There was this brief moment of cultural revival, but then came the absolute horror of Stalin's Great Purge. The entire Belarusian national intelligentsia, we're talking writers, poets, leaders, they were systematically rounded up and executed. And Russification was forced back on everyone with incredible brutality. And if you can believe it, all of that devastation was just a prelude, a warm-up for the absolute catastrophe of World War II. The human cost here, it's just staggering. Think about this. Belarus lost 1/4, 1 out of every 4 people, of its entire pre-war population. That's a higher percentage than any other country in the whole war. The Nazi occupation, from 41 to 44, was just exceptionally brutal. The Germans had a deliberate policy of terror. They burned over 9,000 villages to the ground. They murdered hundreds of thousands of civilians. The country's huge Jewish population was almost completely wiped out in the Holocaust. And yet, out of that unimaginable darkness, one of the largest and most effective partisan resistance movements of the entire war rose up. Hiding in those vast forests and swamps, they fought back and inflicted serious damage on the German war machine. So, after the war, Belarus is rebuilt. It becomes this model Soviet republic, a real hub for industry and manufacturing. But as the Soviet Union stumbles towards its end, 2 major catastrophic events are going to change the country's future forever. The first one was an absolute disaster. In April 1986, the Chernobyl nuclear plant explodes right across the border in Ukraine. But because of the way the wind was blowing, an incredible 60%, 60, of the total radioactive fallout landed on Belarus. It contaminated almost 1/4 of the entire country, poisoning the land for generations. And you can bet it created this deep, simmering anger at the authorities in Moscow, who tried to cover the whole thing up. So you take the Chernobyl disaster, you combine it with the Soviet system just generally falling apart, and that all fuels the push for independence. In 1990, Belarus declares sovereignty. Then, after that failed coup against Gorbachev in Moscow in August 91, they declare full independence. And it all culminates in this historic meeting in December, where the leaders of Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine get together and formally dissolve the Soviet Union. Just like that, it was over. Since 1994, the story of independent Belarus has really been dominated by one person, President Alexander Lukashenko. His time in power has been defined by a few key things: consolidating power in his own hands, maintaining a very close alliance with Russia, and then in 2020, a disputed election that sparked the biggest protests the country had ever seen. And of course, more recently, Belarus was used as a staging ground for Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine. And that brings us right up to today. It leaves us with the same critical question that has really defined Belarus's entire long history. Stuck there, at the crossroads between Russia and the West, what path is it going to take in this crazy 21st century? The final chapter, well, it hasn't been written yet. Hey, if you found this look at Belarus interesting, do us a favor and subscribe to Notebook Summaries. And definitely check out our Quick Country Histories playlist for more deep dives just like this one. Thanks for joining us.